Hello, everyone. We're live. And the agenda for right now is that we're going to hear a lecture by Benjamin Bratton, who's a theorist, sociologist, and his main field of expertise is modern philosophy and design. And I'm an ex-theorist, currently functional programmer, mostly programming in Haskell, but I'll try to use my knowledge a little bit in here for the Q&A session following the lecture, and then we'll open the floor for the questions from the audience.
Shall I begin then?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you today. I unfortunately will obviously not able to come to Poland to speak with you in person, but obviously wish that I had been able to. But hopefully in the future we can do so. The talk that I have prepared today is in response to the theme of the event, the deep, authentic. And in fact, my talk is perhaps arguing to a certain extent against the idea of the authentic as it might be normally understood, and perhaps somewhat counterintuitively is arguing on behalf of the artificial and the synthetic, which are not the same thing, as I'll describe. And so, fair warning in advance, a little bit on this topic. The notion of the authentic, I will sort of say off the top, is a term I personally find a bit unsettling. I dislike the term in many regards. It mostly, I think, in the sense that the way in which the term is deployed and used as a kind of aspiration, and in some cases as an accusation that someone or something or something else is inauthentic in comparison to what? In comparison to some notion of nature or of the uncontaminated. I think in many ways the notion of the authentic is a reactionary and very conservative concept to its core. And so once more, I will be arguing against the motion, and will be encouraging you in some extent to cultivate and express your inauthenticity as much as you like, for permission to do so. So when I think of the authentic, what comes to mind? Well, let me tell you a story of a piece of land. You're probably familiar with this design for the world capital of socialism, so to speak, that was planned to be built in Moscow in the 1930s. With this gigantic, it would have been the largest building in the world, with this gigantic King Kong size Lenin looking over the top of it as well. As we know, the World War II ensued, and the steel required to build this thing was used for other purposes. What were some of those other purposes? Well, you'll notice here that there's a giant circular foundation for this building at the base here. And so that was actually built. This giant circular indentation and foundation was built. And so for much of the 20th century, that foundation was built and became a giant public swimming pool, which you may be familiar with. In Moscow was the largest public swimming pool in the world at that time, and served its purpose quite well. As the more recently, however, as the regimes changed and the times changed along with them, a different notion of the authentic use of this site came to the fore. that building where the capital of socialism building was going to be was also earlier the site of an Orthodox church. And more recently, as the church had come back into political power, the Christ the Savior Cathedral was now built on this site, a building that looks like it was built before socialism and communism. It looks like it was quite old. It's actually quite new. It's probably younger than many of you in the room today, but it is in a sense made to look artificially old, and this artificiality of a certain kind of notion of a conservative and reactionary sense of authentic structure. This is the mode of the authenticity that I find most distasteful. In some sense, it's also derived from, more philosophically speaking, the work of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who spent much of his time worried about authenticity and how it is that one might become authentic. As we all know, this preoccupation led him personally to some rather dubious conclusions as to what one should do with their time, having been a bit more than a collaborator during the Second World War. But another point it might just sort of make is that the notion of the authentic appears to us not as it really is as a sort of antithesis to modernity or technology or industrialization, but as a concept that rides as a kind of permanent passenger on modernity. That the history of modernity come from its very beginnings in the 18th or 18th or 19th century, depending on where you would want to locate it, comes with a kind of reactionary romanticism that imagines itself as adhering to a more authentic way of being, a more authentic relationship to the world than the one on author by the Promethean project of the time. And it tends to imagine itself as always usually kind of uniquely a kind of unique position that is standing against its own particular moment. In reality, it's a kind of endless repetition of the same ideas over and over and over, rediscovering itself because it is amnesic and has this amnesic kind of quality to it. These are, in the 19th century, these were called Adamite movements, Adamite, as in Adam and the Garden of Eden, an idea of going back to a garden in which things were simpler. Not only things were simpler and more and more naive in a way, but that they were more true, more authentic. And it is this idea of sort of returning to some kind of pre-contaminant, earlier golden era that is the aspect that I find most reprehensible. These are images from my favorite episode of Star Trek, when an Adamite hippie group comes on board and sings a lot of folk songs about the planet called Eden that they're going to go to eventually. It also has led, at least in my home country in the United States, to very strange understandings of the material world that have become part of a way in which any of the productive notions around an popular ecological movement have probably been sidelined in many particular kinds of ways. To some extent, this also aligns with a deep personalization or individuation of understandings of what's at stake for our ecological relations to the world. This is a picture I took at my local supermarket that exemplifies this to me rather directly. It's a sign that indicates that if you were to buy a drink from the store, that you will not have to have a plastic straw, that the ritual, the personal individual ritual of buying a smoothie or drink at the store will allow you as an individual to perform the authentic deed of not drinking with a plastic straw. What you see here is, though, is this declaration of authenticity is itself wrapped in a plastic sign sitting on top of a plastic mountain of single-serving water. And so the underlying infrastructural reality doesn't really matter. What matters is the personal, individual performance of authenticity. This is the problem, not the solution. It is tied then, a notion of authenticity, to any number of forms of what in English literature came to be known as pastoralism. Pastoralism, a notion of a kind of a rural, a more rural, natural, slower, more immediate mode of existence that somehow had been displaced by urbanization and modernity. One of the things we find particularly in rich Western countries is a kind of theater of pastoralism, in events like the farmers market, where people who are otherwise able to procure food from other sources will participate in a kind of theatrical experience of the pastoral, as a way of making themselves feel authentic, as a way of imagining a different kind of participating, kind of role-playing participation in a different kind of world. One that is based upon a rather peculiar notion of nature, a concept of nature as a kind of given, something that is relatively stable, but one that is ultimately extraordinarily fragile, intellectually speaking. One of the things that it always seems to forget is the artificiality of the world in which we find ourselves, which itself has led to other kinds of issues. By what I mean by the artificiality of the world in which we find ourselves, I present you with a natural banana. Bananas before more recent efforts in agricultural science to make them more tasteful, nutritious, and indeed seedless. None of us would want to eat a natural banana, and most of us probably haven't eaten one. My point simply is that the things that are taken to be natural are themselves artificial. They are composed, and they should be embraced as such. That the artificiality of the world, the compositionality of the world, is in fact one of the accomplishments of our sentience and our sapience, and not something to be refused. There are other ways in which the notion of the natural leads to other kinds of problems. When there is a strong conceptual distinction between the artificial on the one side and the natural on the other, the reality of the circumstance in which all of these are combined will take its revenge in some ways. The story of Rachel Carson and the carp is probably due here. Rachel Carson, as you know, is the author, you may know, was the author of a book in the 1950s called Silent Spring, which was a foundational text in the environmental movement, not only in the United States but globally. And it was a very important book, a very intelligent book, and one that had enormous positive impact. However, one of the issues that Carson took was an overuse of dangerous chemicals, which is a quite sensible, essential position to have. But one of the recommendations that she made in doing so was that instead of using, in the case of the Mississippi River and the Ohio River in the United States, instead of using chemicals to dissuade or poison invasive, different kinds of vegetative blooms, she recommended the introduction of in this case, invasive species of the Asian carp, in order to eat the excess of the vegetal bloom that was there, instead of using chemicals. In other words, the natural solution would be better than the artificial solution. What has happened, however, is that the carp has taken over the rivers, choked the waterways, and has, in essence, decimated these ecologies in ways that the chemical solution never would have in the first place. And so, for certain, there are unintended consequences of any kind of artificial intervention. There are also unintended consequences of interventions that imagine themselves to be acting on the side of nature. What we conclude then is not that the embrace of a fabricated notion of the authentic will lead us away from these dangers, but that in fact it is one of the things that leads us straight into the middle of them. So let me then speak a little bit on the more positive aspect of the talk, which would be about, if not necessarily the inauthentic, at least the artificial. So what do I mean by the artificial? The artificial is a term that has many connotations. It sometimes means as in artifice, as in fake, but also as an artifact, as in an artifact that is made. And so one way to think about the artificial is not as in faked, but as composed, as in deliberately designed. And as you see here, this is not a Photoshop image. This is a forest in Japan. And I bet everyone in the room can point to the trees that were planted, that were artificially planted by the Forestry Service in Japan there. And the reason you're able to pick them out is because they have what we call anomalous regularity. Anomalous regularity. What that means is that there's a regularity in the pattern that is unusual, that is anomalous, that is basically impossible to have happened just on its own. So one way to think about the artificial is in the telltale sign of this design ability, this composability that we might see in the anomalous regularity. That also means a notion of artificial that is not, as opposed to the notion of artificial as in fake. These are images of fake people, a website that sort of a number of websites you can go to that will generate. In this case, there's a system was trained on Hollywood actors, and the AI system will generate images of generic Hollywood actors that look exactly like Hollywood actors to me. Having been born in Los Angeles, I'm surrounded by these creatures, but they are in fact not real people as we would normally associate them. But it's a different notion of artificial that I'm actually trying to get at. Now, let's speak though for a moment about artificial as in artificial intelligence. What do we mean by artificial in the notion of artificial intelligence? What is artificial about it? How is it different than natural intelligence? Is its artificiality mean it's an inauthentic intelligence or not intelligent at all? Well, these are very difficult questions. And indeed, the very idea of what is and isn't artificial is different in different cultures. Even in the history, looking at the histories of different European cultures, the notion of the boundary between the artificial and natural is quite different. I do a fair bit of work in China, and the notion of the artificial there is very different than it is in the West more broadly. And so what would constitute artificial intelligence is also quite different because the very idea of the artificial is different. So the picture I show you here is of Alan Turing, a young Alan Turing, who in his 20s had a number of important philosophical thought experiments that eventuated into the modern computer, another into machine intelligence more broadly. You probably know Turing mostly through what has come to be known as the Turing test, which he initiates the imitation game, which was the inspiration also for the Voight-Kampff empathy test from Blade Runner. But as you know, more likely, the test involves a computer pretending to be a human in order for the human to figure out whether this computer is in fact intelligent. So let's think of that, about that scenario for a moment. The idea is that machines are intelligent, or can be said to be intelligent, if they can perform thinking the way that a human thinks that a human thinks. And so the quality of its intelligence is dependent upon that kind of narcissistic, anthropocentric recognition. Now, Turing didn't really mean it that way. Turing meant it as what's called a sufficient condition for intelligence. That is, if it can do this, then it probably is intelligent. But it has become, in essence, a necessary condition of intelligence. That is, unless the computer can pass as a human, then it is not intelligent. And this question of passing a creature, an entity that has to pass as something else, also has a dark and ironic and sour connotation with regards to Turing's own biography. So where does this lead us? Well, one direction is that instead of to sort of extend this critique of the Turing test, it would lead us to understand that perhaps intelligence exists in ways that are quite not only ones that are recognizably human, but in a lot of other diverse ways that might be difficult for humans to recognize, but that are still intelligent. And that the evolution of intelligence over billions of years on Earth, from sentience to sapience, is one that is quite diverse. And that it might take the form of different forms of animal intelligence, it might take different forms of vegetal intelligence, and indeed now machine intelligence. So why would we say that one form is artificial and another form is natural exactly? What would be the condition by which we would make that decision? Well, if we mean artificial as in fake, it's difficult to say so. Why one is a natural intelligence and one is a fake intelligence, if it actually is genuinely intelligent, just in a strange and new way. But if we take artificial to mean not fake, but as in deliberately composed, as in anomalous regularity, then yes, we can find several examples of a kind of artificial intelligence. One example is when I was a few years ago visiting the Sony AI lab in Tokyo, they showed us some work they had done with robot languages. The text you see there at the bottom, Waboda mo tolibu da hakedi, this is a made-up language. This is an artificial language that was originally composed so that one robot could teach another robot how to do a task. In this case, pick up that yellow thing and put it on top of the box. Now, an interesting thing happened is that over a few days and weeks, the robots became very fluent in this language, but also the language itself evolved very quickly and became almost indecipherable to the researchers at the lab, which they found very interesting in its own regard. And so this then poses a more difficult decision. On the one hand, about its artificiality, that is. On the one hand, yes, this is an artificial form of intelligence in the sense in which it was composed and designed. It didn't just happen on its own as a kind of emergent evolutionary phenomenon. And there is regularity in these utterances. Like the robots can make lots of sounds, but there's a anomalous regularity in their enunciations that we can tell this is actually, yes, this is a formal language. On the other hand, there was also later a kind of natural emergence that occurred of evolution within this language that occurred just by its being out in the wild, with the robots using it in a different kind of way. And so you see my point here. Yes, it's artificial in some regards. No, it's not artificial in other regards. But I think it is authentic. I think it is a kind of authentic language. I wouldn't want to say anything otherwise for this as well. But to step back to Turing for a moment, I would say that in many regards, that the growth of machine intelligence in the world, its own evolution is hamstrung by many ideologies around artificial intelligence, which are in turn hobbled by, I think, very clumsy misconceptions about what is and what is not artificial, and thus what is and what is not intelligent. It's simply more, these are important questions, but it's more complicated. One thing I'm quite sure of, though, is that foremost among these misapprehensions, these mistakes, is the presumption that machine intelligence must be recognizably human-like in order for it to qualify as being intelligent, and that if it doesn't, it is not intelligent, that it is inauthentic in some way. I think that these kinds of anthropomorphic biases and presumptions have left us with it left us less capable than we should be in making sense of the already remarkable things that machine intelligence does do and does accomplish, that we don't really have a language to describe because we are trying to describe it in relationship to frameworks that are old and inadequate. AI may not work in ways that look anything like human thought. And also, it may also, like for natural language processing, look like things that look very much like human thought. But we need to find a different criteria. So what is it? What are some other kinds of criteria by which we might think this through? Well, one is, and as I mentioned at the beginning, might be the difference between what we call the artificial versus the synthetic. Now, these are, in everyday language, these terms are used pretty much interchangeably, but they have a more specific and important distinction between them. In a book from 1968 called The Sciences of the Artificial, Herbert Simon, who was involved in those years in what was called good old-fashioned AI, or top-down symbolic modeling of AI, he offered this distinction between the artificial and the synthetic that I think is remains not only relevant, but in many respects crucial. So for Simon, the artificial does imply the counterfeit or a deception. And the example that he uses is of a fake diamond jewelry that's made out of glass, but it is carved to resemble a real gemstone. It's not a real diamond. It has nothing to do with a diamond. It's just a piece of glass, but it looks like a diamond. It pretends to be a diamond. So this is artificial. The synthetic, though, means something different. The synthetic means something that is deliberately created, but which is a real version of the thing that may also exist in some natural evolutionary process. So the example he gives of this is of a laboratory-grown diamond, a lab-grown diamond that is atomically, molecularly identical to a diamond you might find out of the pit. It's not a fake. It is diamond. It is real in a real sense, but it is also composed. So this synthetic diamond is then qualitatively different than the artificial diamond. So you see the difference. Now, if using this distinction between the synthetic and the artificial, we see that there is a major difference between what we might call artificial intelligence and what we might call synthetic intelligence. An artificial intelligence in Simon's model would mean something that looks intelligent, but really isn't. It appears to be intelligent, it pretends to be intelligent, but there's really nobody at home. Siri or Cortana or Alexa might be examples of a artificial intelligence in that point, that because they sound like a person, we imagine that they have intelligence, that they have intentionality, that they have an inner life, but they don't. A synthetic intelligence, however, is one that really does, is some kind of intelligence that was deliberately composed, that is a genuine intelligence, but is maybe difficult for us to recognize, but is not artificial in the sense of fakery. Now, what are some examples of how this might work? And there's also then, let me complicate this yet further, add another layer to this, by suggesting that there's, in addition to Simon's notion of a synthetic intelligence, there's also another notion of the synthetic that is worth considering here, and that is the notion of synthesis. synthesis, of bringing things together and resolving them. The synthesis of human and machine intelligence in the pursuit of insights or creativity, for example, things that would be impossible for either one to do on their own. Humans couldn't do it by themselves, machines couldn't do it by themselves, but humans and machines together can form these kinds of insights and have concepts and intelligence that wouldn't. That's also a kind of synthesis, and a synthetic intelligence is also important. Now, let me show the example that I'm showing you here, an example of how this may work. You may be familiar with this, with at least part of this example. This is a famous scene from a famous match, as you see from 2016, between Lee Sedol, South Korean Go master, and AlphaGo, which was a Go playing AI developed by DeepMind, a Google research group based in London. And famously, in this, I believe in the second game between Sedol and Go, the AI's move 37, which you see here, was a move that Go expert that totally confounded the game. That was a move that Sedol had never anticipated. That in essence nobody had done before, and in fact the commentators thought the AI had made a mistake, and that this was very embarrassing for DeepMind, and that their computer had gone nuts and put the stone in the wrong in a completely crazy place. And that this would work. Sedol saw it differently, and once he began to think about the implications of this move, he kind of he had to leave the table, throw water in his face, and he realized something that he realized not immediately, but eventually, that the computer had made him, in his own words, the AI had made a move that no human would have made. That it wasn't just repeating like lots and lots of human moves, but somehow, in the combination of the human intelligence, the programmers, and the machine intelligence of the mechanisms of calculation, it had come up with something novel. It had invented a way of seeing the Go board that had not been there before. So that's not the example of synthetic intelligence I want to describe, though this is an important one. It's actually what happens in the next game that is the relevant issue here. In the next game, Sedol's move 78 was equally unexpected and equally creative, a move that he never would have made. And he declared afterwards that he made this move based on the kind of new understanding of the way the Go board might be seen and intuited and understood that had come from the move before. In essence, by playing the machine, Sedol became a better Go player, and he began to see and be more and have a creative capacity in playing the game that he would not have had before. This is a kind of genuine synthetic intelligence of humans and machines collaborating in a way not just for purposes of efficiency, but for creativity and novelty, as well. By the way, there was a project that we did at Strelka Institute last year, which I'll talk to you a little bit about. I am also the director of a think tank based in Moscow called the Terraforming, where we are indeed exploring some of the planetary, ecological, economic, and governing complexities around the intrinsically artificial predicament in which we find ourselves. I'm just scrubbing through the film, but one of the things every year we make about 9 or 10 design research films that are exploring some of the philosophical and practical consequences of these ideas. And I'll invite you to watch the whole film together. But this one, a group of some of our researchers, Joel and Nicole and Lyra, developed their own approach and understanding of the conditions by which synthetic intelligence might be thought to emerge. And for them, it has everything to do with the site, the physical, spatial condition and location between multiple actors in this regard, which a dynamic which we also see in itself in nature. That's not necessarily a matter of only the artificial. So Let me then move to another question, another notion of the artificial in relationship to the image, in relationship to the image in the age of digital reproduction. Most of us are probably familiar with the thesis from Walter Benjamin's work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in which he discusses how mechanical reproducibility of the image destroys or dissolves some sense of the aura of the original of the work of art. And that is that in the mechanical reproduction of the image, a sense of the auratic original, that is its originality and its authenticity, becomes dissipated into the proliferation of copies. And I think in many respects his thesis holds true. What I want to suggest, however, is that as this has extended into new regimes of digital imaging and infrastructure, that a kind of inverse phenomenon has taken place. That is, that the digital reproducibility of the image, or of the world rendered as a sensed image, has actually refocused its attention on the original and the authentic in other ways. But let me make the argument to you more fully. So vision has evolved many times in evolutionary perspective. Photoreceptor cells, light-sensitive cells, are found across many different phyla and evolved from many different kinds of chemoreceptors over time. And it's likely that these photoreceptor cells evolved, in most cases, evolved in advance of or before any kind of brain-like information processing organs. That is, it's not that there's a brain that grows eyes, but rather there are eyes that grow a brain. Now, arguably, over the past 2 decades, vision has evolved again. This time, not for cuttlefish, as in the last image, or for rattlesnakes, or for people, but for networked CCD sensors and algorithmic armatures that process what is sensed into differentiated and motivated recognition. That machine vision is another step in this evolutionary process. In many cases, though, the function of representation is rather different, and that the data doesn't necessarily have to become an image in the way in which humans think of an image in order for it to be understood. It doesn't need to be rendered as a picture because the algorithm that is programmed to discern different patterns in the data that is sensed can see those patterns directly in the data itself without reprojecting that data as an image and then seeing the patterns in that projection. In that sense, that we have an image without the visual, if you like, and this is perhaps a bit like photosynthesis, is also a kind of photoreceptor without images in a different sort of way. Now, it all depends a little bit about how, now thinking about the replication of the digital image, it depends a bit how you might want to quantify what counts as an image. But what Benjamin called the mechanical reproducibility of images has certainly allowed them to proliferate well beyond the domain of human craft and recognition. Today, the industrial scale processing of data that is gleaned by scanning light in some way, from urban scale street surveillance to millimeter scale quality control assembly lines, represents a significant fraction of all the ways in which the world images itself. At the end of the day, machines take more images than people do. And machines take more images for machines to look at than people do for people machines. The production of imagery has not only become mechanized, it has become more the domain of machines itself. So the question is, back to the images, do plants, like plants, like photosynthesis, for example, do machines process this as a kind of vision without images, or at least they have a different reaction to this dynamic? Now, here's the point, and perhaps this is surprising, perhaps not, but today, the function of most of these machinic images, or plurality of these machinic images today, is to determine the originality and veracity of the things that those images represent. And so in this exponential mechanization of the image, the importance of the original actually returns. How do I mean this? Well, let me take some examples. This is a $100 bill, as you recognize from the United States. It is an image. It's a piece of paper with a number of images on it. It is also a machine. Most of the images that you see here on this piece of paper are not only pictures so that humans can recognize that this is a $100 bill and that it's worth, this piece of paper is worth this amount of money, but it is also a piece of paper full of counterfeit prevention technologies that will guarantee that this piece of paper is the original, authentic $100 bill. We look at them and we see a picture. A machine looks at them and is looking at whether that's the right green ink or whether or not there's the other kinds of materials are properly, or whether this light is reflecting a certain way, and they are able to determine that yes, this is an original, authentic dollar bill. We also have this interesting phenomenon here of when the image itself becomes a machine. It's not that they have machines produce more images. In the case of this, the image is a machine. It's a authenticity generated machine in this regard. Or we can, in terms of the way in which the mechanized image becomes the basis for the originality, we can think of the ways in which surveillance systems might be able to, are as they might scan a city for a suspect. In this case, the Boston, the fellow who set off bombs at the Boston Marathon was running throughout the city. They're not looking, the surveillance system is not necessarily looking for everyone. It's looking for someone in particular. It's trying to pick out the one face from thousands, trying to find the true one target from all of these possible things. Or as in the work of Maurizio Cersini, you see that we commonly will, when very, very expensive paintings are sold from one museum to another, the insurance companies will demand demand a proof of the authenticity of the object. In many cases, that involves, in this case of Maurizio's work, putting very tiny cameras into the cracks in the paint on the canvas and doing all kinds of full spectrum analysis of different parameters of the materials that constitute the painting in order to determine that this is the original authentic object in one way or another. One of my favorite projects in AI art of recent is a project by Alice Hughes at Princeton, who had trained GANs to do traditional Chinese landscape paintings. You see there on the left the original human paintings and some of the training structures, and then on the far right some of the landscape paintings that was able to generate by itself. I much to say about this in terms of the relationship between the authentic and the inauthentic, the natural and the artificial, particularly in the way in which these kinds of traditional landscape paintings are understood and circulated as sort of artifacts and documents of a kind of authentic original aesthetic. So most of us are also probably familiar, speaking of sort of verifying the original and the authentic, we're all kind of familiar with CAPTCHA systems, where instead of with the Turing test, the human is trying to figure out whether the computer is authentic or not. Here, the computer is trying to figure out whether the human is authentic or not, but both of which are trying to determine the authenticity and originality of whatever they're interacting with. And so, how do we conclude? We might say that Walter Benjamin's assurances that mechanical reproduction would undermine the aura of the original is true when, for example, we compare a painting with a postcard of a painting. But when machine vision and indeed images as machines are put to work for the purposes of assuring the originality of what they represent, the verified non-fakes, the true identities, the unbroken versions, the normal targets, and the certified real deals, something else occurs. A full revolution is made back around as the image is more, that is, as the image is more fully technologized, it becomes itself a machine. And so Benjamin's historical arc from pre-mechanical original to mechanical copy is incomplete without another curve one leading now back to what, a kind of machinic authentic, or something along these lines. Now, I think seeing ourselves through the eyes of this, of seeing ourselves as represented through the eyes of this machinic other, is actually quite important philosophically. We see ourselves in a way in which we're not particularly used to seeing. I call this phenomenon the inverse uncanny valley. The uncanny valley being you see a creature in the world, it looks kind of human, not quite human, and we find it aesthetically disturbing because of this. The inverse uncanny valley is when you see yourself through the eyes of the machine and you don't quite recognize yourself. You're somewhat disturbed by what you see because your self-image of what you imagine yourself to be is not what you see in front of you. And this dislocation is, in fact, I think, enormously instructive. We might argue that it is such moments of demystifying confrontations with what we are but don't imagine ourselves to be are not only psychologically instructive, but indeed politically so in some kind of regards. And so all of the kinds of questions around the delimitation of the real and the fake, what you really are, what you really imagine yourself to be, what your sense, your affective sense of the authentic might be versus the underlying reality that makes you possible. Which one is artificial, which one is not artificial. These all operate in a number of different kinds of strange dynamics, fluid relationships, internal and external paradoxes and contradictions to themselves, many of which are generated by the question of whether or not this is real or not, whether or not this is a simulation or not, as such. A process by which is probably intrinsic to some extent of how our cognition works and how our ways in which we perceive the world. Our apophenic responses of seeing faces and things and seeing patterns and trying and understanding the world in relationship to these patterns and trying to deduce trying to deduce the veracity of things accordingly is fundamental to our evolution. And so it's not surprising that it would continue in this kind of regard. At the same time, however, with an eye towards the synthetic intelligence and the generation of novelty and the generation of creativity and how it is that we might work in relationship to artificial systems, it's exactly it is sort of these kinds of mistakes and glitches that are in some cases also generative of novelty. This is some images from an earlier version of Google Translate's machine vision, where you hold the phone up to something in a different language, in this case a menu in Russian, and it will translate into a different language. In the course of doing so, generating this sort of amazing poetry along the lines. It works quite well, much better than it used to. In a certain sense, something is perhaps lost in that's been lost. There was a moment in which it was kind of perfectly tuned to provide a kind of accidental commentary on all the rest of this around this as well. But to conclude my remarks, what I would want to suggest here is that the question about whether or not oneself is authentic or whether one's found one's sort of authentic self always needs to be couched in an understanding that the self and your experience of the world is nothing if not artificial in all of the possible senses in which we have described it. And in that sense, there's nothing more authentic, if you like, than embracing this inauthenticity. It also, I think, has to another sort of point of sort of continuance for perhaps our discussion having to do with the question of the authenticity of lands and of landscapes, and not just of people. Part of the violence of the colonial era was also the notion that these lands that were settled were empty, that they were pristine in some way. They were not pristine. They were settled. They were already artificially constructed by those who had lived there for generations. We're seeing a number of repetition of this dynamic around colonial space around discussions of the exploration of outer space. And by that, I don't mean that the term colonization of space is problematic. What I mean is the notion that these lands are pristine, and that therefore there is a continuity with the colonial era. Well, Mars, the uninhabited nature of Mars, the uninhabited nature of the moon makes them fundamentally different than the spaces of the colonial era. And to confuse them in this way is that this is the part that is, in fact, most disturbing. So, last point, and I'll sort of leave you with this, and we can open it up from a little bit of discussion in this sense, is I would like to, as the keynote speaker, give the attendees permission to be inauthentic, to cultivate your inauthenticity in whatever ways that you like, not to let any of the romantic reactionary crackpots tell you otherwise, and in doing so, I think you'll find the better path. Lastly, just I'll put in a plug and also maybe some follow-on comments. Some of the work that you're seeing and that we've discussed comes from this the program at Strelka called the Terraforming. We are in the process of accepting applications through early November to join us for the third year. I invite you to look at the terraforming.strelka.com to look at all of the work. The best argument for the program is the work that the researchers do, and that concludes my my discussion for today. And I thank you for this and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Benjamin.
Let me try to unshare.
Okay. Okay. Wow, what an echo. Wow, what an echo. So, my first question. How do you think which of these terms, synthetic, natural, artificial, and nature, should be preserved, kept, or perhaps reused in the context of global warming, which is a topic that you employ them quite a lot?
Yeah. Well, I'm not arguing against it. I think all words should be continued. I like words, and so I would want to keep them all. I think the question is, but the words also evolve, and their meanings change over time. The notion of nature is itself an artificial construct. The notion of nature is an artificial construct, and so I think we can use these terms in different ways. In terms of global warming, I would put it this way. I would say that the issue, what we call anthropogenic global warming, that is global warming that is caused by humans, it's quite clear to me that the most viable and equitable and pragmatic responses to anthropogenic global warming will have to be also anthropogenic. That instead of understanding the response to global warming as a kind of refusal of the artificial and a revitalization of Victorian era concepts of the natural as a kind of bulwark against this, that we need to embrace the anthropogenic quality of this, embrace the artificial, and in fact learn greater confidence with it. The issue is not that in this regard is not that sapience or has had impact on the world. The question is the kind of impact that it has and the calibration for it. But I think that probably puts me a little bit at odds with some of the positions within the mainstream environmental movement that might be that itself has historically emerged in relationship from the a kind of capital R romantic view of the world and nature and its own position in opposition to modernity, which is not a position I share.
Okay, so the another question I have is a question about you say about artificial, the good artificial, that it is deliberately designed. Sometimes we talk the same about the synthetic. So my question is, what is the place, or even it's broader, it's a question of agency of a designer in that deliberate design process. Who is the agency, or what is the agency?
Yeah, well, it obviously depends. So I think that the artificial in this sense, I mean, what I tried to present were a few different, possible definitions of the word, because, words are words. The world is real. The words just try to catch up with the world. The words aren't real themselves, other than specific ways. But the notion of the artificial as composed or deliberate, in a certain, or has this sort of telltale sign, is something that has, real consequences. I think, right now there's all this discussion of whether or not the coronavirus that came to us from Wuhan was artificial or natural. To some extent, those discussions themselves are highly politicized, obviously, but those who know much more about molecular biology than I do, when they look at the genome of the virus, what they're looking for is anomalous regularity. They're looking for telltale signs of artificiality, which means regularity within this that would not naturally have occurred. And everyone I know who here at UCSD who works on this indicates that no, there's nothing to show there that suggests that this is in fact artificial. However, to the question of the agency around this, well, the thing is that, there's a design likes to think about itself in a way that's perhaps overestimates its own kind of agency, that there is a designer, an architect, an agent somewhere in the system who has sort of who is responsible for everything that happens, that comes from their desk and their idea down the line. But the history of, just looking around the room in which everyone is sitting, the history of the artificial built environment in which we live is not one in which there was one person who did all of these things, that they are part of an ongoing intergenerational material culture in which certain materials become possible to use, certain forms become standardized, certain logistical processes have their own kinds of demands. Insurance companies have demands upon the organization of a space. The agency is always broadly distributed in one way, in a lot of different ways. That doesn't mean it's regular. There are ways in which, obviously, the state as a client, or the state as a institutional position that might decide the parameters through which design and designation can happen, does not necessarily have the same interests as capital, which is another kind of institutional form that provides constraints and context for design. Nor is it the same institutional context of religion, or of any of these, or any of the kinds of others that sort of move along the structures of this kind of line. Now, I'll just sort of cut to the chase in a sense. I think that in relationship to the issue of climate change that you brought up at this moment, is that we're living through, in a way, a kind of crisis of agency. We don't have the agency that is necessary to bring about a structural and systemic transformation that we might all understand on some level and in different ways is necessary, doesn't seem to exist. And I think we saw that with the pandemic as well, that we had this planetary scale crisis, that we understood conceptually what needed to happen. We had technological means to do so. But in most Western countries, and one of my recent book was about this topic, the governing capacity to actually act on behalf of the implications of what we know and the implications of what we are able to do doesn't exist. So I think in the bigger picture, there is a kind of crisis of the absence of collective, structural, infrastructural agency, a crisis of governance in the broadest sense of the term, which doesn't just mean the state. It means the ways in which societies are deliberately compose themselves artificially. And that part of the challenge for thinking about governance for the next century or so will have to do with an understanding that this societal self-composition has to do with local and regional concerns, but it also, in many cases, has to do with planetary concerns that give the constraining context of those regional concerns, like a pandemic, like climate change, like migration, like corporate taxation, like carbon taxation. These are all planetary scale conditions that require some kind of deliberate composition, agency, action. To assume that they will just solve themselves bottom up through some kind of emergent process hasn't worked. And so the question of agency is here's one that is central to the thought, to the working of the zone. But the way in which I think about this is more at the level of how can systems, social systems, where is the positions of agency within social systems that they would be able to actually compose themselves with the reason through which they're capable, rather than thinking through agency as, which kind of designer do we need sitting in which chair, who is somehow responsible for the everything that ensues from this as well. I see this as a over individuation of the situation. So that would be my reply.
Another question. I'm quite suspicious, actually, of the term and the definition of synthetic, because I feel as if this distinction between artificial as something less than synthetic as something derivatory, merely replique, might entail that something that is in fact synthetic has some sense of a depth, and that depth is for me kind of dangerous, because that's exactly the place where we made mistakes with nature. It was that deep, it was this much human that we wanted to see the same, for example, traits in computer as we see in ourselves. Do you see the same danger, or you see kind of a different way of rethinking or recomposing that depth into other means?
No, it's a good question. So again, I want to suggest that the terms that I'm using here are not meant to. Are they really meant to? They are adjectives to describe phenomenon. I don't know that they necessarily have that they resolve some of these value questions. There are things that are synthetic that are bad, and things that are artificial that are good, and all these around these things as well. So I'm not arguing, in essence. I'm not attempting to be the lawyer on behalf of the synthetic by arguing that this will sort of solve all of these things as well. It's more of a distinction between this. Now, your question about is there a way in which let me rephrase the question in a way in which, if I understand it, make sure that we're on the same page. That if the way in which I understand it is that perhaps if the notion of the synthetic is one in which there is a kind that, let's say, for example, of a synthetic intelligence, that this would involve the deliberate composition of a form of intelligence that is in some way genuinely intelligent, that it has real intelligent capacities within it, but it did not emerge in nature, all through long-term natural selection processes, and therefore as a kind of synthetic intelligence. That might be a kind of intelligence that we would have not only not recognized ourselves in, but would have a great deal of difficulty recognizing, because we hadn't seen it before. And so we have this interesting paradox. On the one hand, humans may have composed this intelligence, and yet the humans may not be able to recognize this intelligence once they have composed it, or not understand really what has necessarily been made. In that example of the robot language being perhaps an example there as well. Now, we don't only have to talk about intelligence, but this is maybe the topic that I've introduced. Now, is there a version of synthetic intelligence, or a sense of the pursuit of synthetic intelligence, that would have an inverse, a different kind of momentum? That is, in the idea of trying to reproduce or replicate the dominant model of intelligence that we understand, which is human intelligence, though we don't really understand that. Is the question, is the pursuit of a synthetic intelligence possibly going to drive a kind of soft or hard anthropomorphism in trying to arrive at a kind of in a kind of intelligence in this regard? Certainly, this is also possible in this regard. The question, though, is like there may be ways in which and I think we see this with natural language processing, which is a form of AI that is very much based on human cultural systems. There is nevertheless a kind of a kind of evolution that takes place within very large NLP models, that where the language becomes something other than the human version of this language. It's the language itself comes to take on a different kind of different kinds of properties than it had before. So what I mean to say is, even if we're trying to make something that is, we can look in the mirror and see ourselves because we imagine this is in the narcissism, that this is the proper pursuit, that doesn't mean that's what we get. We may get something that is genuinely synthetic intelligence that isn't what we meant to pursue. And I say that has to be possible because the inverse is possible. That is, in our attempts to make synthetic intelligence, we have certainly arrived at different kinds of artificial intelligence, things that look intelligent, sound intelligent, smell intelligent, but really aren't. And in many cases, many people are satisfied with that. But this is not the real pursuit. So perhaps if I haven't answered your question in the way in which you would like me to, we can try to sort of accommodate the differences of having this conversation over the Atlantic Ocean. If you'd like to re-ask the question more specifically, I'd be happy to make sure I've actually attended to your point.
I think you answered to my question, especially with NLP, because I didn't understood you at first, that when you said that it's similar to the way humans process language. I don't make n-grams in my mind when I listen to you speak, so I'm unlike an NLP model.
Not all NLP.
Okay.
Not all NLP.
So I guess that the answer was sufficient. Thank you. Another question. Let's think which one. Okay, you were also like talking about other types of synthesis, like a synthesis between human and the machine. And I was thinking how many, like, what's the level of interaction? Can it be something only as simple as this, like, learning from watching one another, or some deeper forms of interaction than the one that went on with AlphaGo?
One hopes all kinds of deeper forms of this rule, but I think the simple ones are important too. I think it's important to remember that our human intelligence, our natural human intelligence, our capacity for sapience abstraction is a byproduct of our technical cultures, that we learned that it through tool use and through pictorial abstraction, through different forms of functional and instrumental technologization of our immediate environment, Paleolithic cultures, Neolithic cultures, that the process that our intelligence emerges in response to this, that our capacity for abstraction at a neurological level is a result of the demands that our technical cultures made possible. Other things as well, our necessity to navigate landscapes and to memorize, what you can eat and what you cannot eat, lots of other things too. But that it's not that the kind of sort of commonsensical notion is that we developed an intelligence and therefore picked up tools and used them. The dynamic is much more interrelated, that through the ongoing process of human evolution, that our technicity and our intelligence co-evolved in turn. The reason I suggest this is to such a certain extent that this principle of a synthetic intelligence with modes, I'm trying to identify modes of synthetic intelligence with AI. I don't mean to propose this as some kind of futuristic novelty, but rather as some sort of new, unprecedented phenomenon, but quite the opposite, as a continuity with the ongoing arc of evolution of intelligence more generally on Earth. In this case, you have an AI that its technicity is one that is related to our capacities for cognition, our capacities for pattern recognition, our capacities for foresight, our capacities for strategy, planning, and so forth. And so the kinds of synthesis that can take place with this can take any number of different forms, and I think do in many regards already. There are lots of ways in which artists collaborating with AIs in order to produce images or music or sound, images or music or other kinds of forms of expression that are not simply faster, better versions of what was happening before, but represent modes of expression, genres, forms, formats, aesthetics that perhaps we don't really have quite of a language for yet, and it's beginning to evolve beginning to take on its own kind of development. Those can be very private, small, immediate moments of discovery that might take place in one studio. On the other end, there's also one of the more amazing things, one of the, I think, more amazing accomplishments of the DeepMind project to date has been the work on protein folding and the use of AIs to develop this sort of an enormous number of geometries in relationship to how proteins fold and bond to the surface of molecules. The implications of this for drug discovery, for basic understanding of molecular machinery, and how to compose this in general will have very, very long-term effects, not between one person and one machine in the Lisa Dole sense. Like with the Lisa Dole, you got one person, one machine. Maybe with the artist, you have one artist, one machine. No, with the protein folding, this is a kind of synthetic intelligence that happens at an institutional or infrastructural level, and will do so over the course of generations. That the capacity for capacity for molecular design will be greatly accelerated by one assumes by the having accomplished this protein folding structure theories as well. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to point at in terms of the question of what AI is for. The argument I wish to make here is not that all of these problems are solved now that we have AI. AI will solve all of this. We just need to get out of the way. That's not my argument whatsoever. The argument really is, as I suggest, what is AI for? We have this. There has been this long-term emergence of animal intelligence, vegetal intelligence. We now beginning to have machine intelligence that seems to be very good at very specific kinds of things, terrible at other kinds of things. The language we've used to describe this is deeply anthropomorphic, deeply anthropocentric, and it's missing all of the interesting things that the machine intelligence is actually doing. So perhaps we need to take a step back and ask this more fundamental normative question of the purpose of AI. And I also think that, and if this point wasn't clear, that one of the other unfortunate legacies of Turing's test, which we see repeated with the Lee Sedol versus AlphaGo thing, is that somehow this is a zero-sum game, that like either the human wins or the machine wins. Either the computer is a human or it's not, but it's always like it's one or the other. And this feeds into a kind of replacement theory of AI, that humans are being replaced by AI, that to the extent to which AI is ascendant, humans are being demoted in some kind of regard. Part of the impetus and gesture towards a synthetic intelligence suggests that the history of technology doesn't suggest this, that one replaces the other really necessarily, but rather that we should think about modes of connection and collaboration between mammal intelligence and machine intelligence that would allow for forms of cognition that would otherwise be impossible for either one to do on their own. And that this, as a kind of direction for our thinking about this purpose of like what AI is for, should have considerable gravity in that discussion.
My microphone is not working again. Thank you so much. Right now, I'm opening the floor for questions from the audience.
Or comments or whatever you like. I'm very happy to engage on any way you would like.
Okay. No questions? Okay. In that case, thank you very much, Benjamin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was my pleasure. I look forward to hopefully meeting all of you in person at sometime soon. And I look, if you're interested in learning more about my work, you can, Bratton.info website has lots of sort of to do. And I look forward to keeping in contact with all of you. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.